There are all these different bacteria in your gut, and they all have favorite foods. So one guy or gal might like, mangoes. Another might like blueberries. Another might like asparagus. So we don't know who likes what. So we're kind of just eating a diverse rainbow of foods to feed all of them.
Hello and welcome back to the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emmie Brown, joined by our amazing co-host, Melissa Gentile. Today, we're joined by Dr. Christine Bishara, physician, gut health expert, author of The Gut Revolution, which I have right here, and we'll be speaking to that a little bit today, and lead author of the first scientific peer-reviewed study on the connection between COVID severity and gut health. In this episode, we're delving into one of her core passions, the incredible power of Bifidobacterium, a beneficial gut microbe with surprising links to immunity, longevity, and even COVID resilience in children. Whether you're a practitioner or just gut curious, this conversation will open your eyes to what's possible when we truly listen to the signals of our gut. And we're so excited to welcome Dr. Bishara. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, it's so great to have you on the show. And Dr. Bishara, I wanted to start off a little bit about you and your background before we dive into all the details. So your journey started very personally. So can you share how your childhood experience influenced your approach to medicine?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was obese as a child, and obesity tends to run in my family. But if I'm being honest, so did eating styles. And so I kind of just grew up eating a lot more than I probably should have at the time. And for me, I wanted to lose weight because I just had this visit with a doctor, my pediatrician, one summer. And I think everybody kind of hates to be weighed, but when you're overweight, it's even worse. So I remember the day very specifically where she weighed me and said, "You're 30 pounds over the upper limit of normal." And she said to me, "You're never going to lose that weight." And so for me, that was almost just like incentive to prove her wrong. And I guess that's just my personality. But so that summer, I was a sophomore in high school. That summer, I decided I really want to try to lose weight. I had tried in the past with, some effort, you lose a little bit of weight and then you gain it back. But that summer, what I think was really profound for me was that I changed what I ate and the times that I ate. And I think those two factors were really important for me in my weight loss journey. And so at the time, we didn't really know about intermittent fasting, but I kind of just was starting to restrict my eating to 8 hours or less. And what I found was I could probably get away with eating a little bit more when I did that. And I also started really incorporating more plant-based fibers, which at the time I didn't realize, but now we know that those plant-based fibers feed our gut bacteria and they have a really direct effect on our satiety centers. And so at the time I didn't realize it. And so now putting two and two together, I think that's why I was successful. But it's also kind of when I went to medical school and I started learning all these biochemical pathways and putting things together, nutrition became my passion. And so that's where I am now. It took a long road. And I think for a lot of traditionally trained medical doctors, unfortunately, we aren't really trained in nutrition and dietary effects on our health as much as I would like. And I really hope that will change. And I know, Emmie, you're a naturopathic doctor, and I really have a lot of respect for naturopathic doctors. And I hope that one day, traditionally trained physicians and naturopaths can kind of work together and really impact people's lives in the way that it should be, because diet and lifestyle really is a big difference for weight management, also overall health.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bishara. And on that note, I'm curious, sure there's some trial and error. You said it was a long road. I mean, starting in high school and then through medical school and maybe getting a little bit of nutrition. I know there's a consensus in terms of not getting enough nutrition education and traditional medical education. So what was some of that trial and error? I'm curious as far as that long road, as far as maybe like what were some pearls that you learned along the way that inspired to you as far as where you are now?
Right. And again, it's a work in progress. So that summer when she told me I was 30 pounds over my upper limit of normal, I was actually 60 pounds overweight. And so I lost about 30 pounds that summer. And again, it was kind of just a trial and error, restricting your eating times, not knowing why it worked. And then the funny thing is, when I entered medical school, I was still a little bit overweight. And the first year I studied biochemistry. And then I learned all these pathways like glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. And I'm not going to get too much detail, but basically it's our body's backup mechanisms to food. So yes, food does feed our cells, but then our cells have these backup mechanisms when we're not eating, right? I mean, this is why we don't die during the night, because our body taps into these backup mechanisms, like burning fuel from the liver, which is glycogen, and fueling our cells, but then making fuel from fat cells to feed our cells even after that. So for me, it was kind of like, oh, wow, it was like a light bulb moment where I was like, oh, this is why, 10 years ago, this was actually working for me, is because I was tapping into these pathways that I didn't even realize. So it was definitely a work in progress. A lot of my friends in medical school used to say I was crazy because they're like, you're starving yourself. And I said, I'm not really starving myself. I'm just eating during a restricted time period. And now we know that intermittent fasting is so important for weight loss, but it's also so important for immune health because of these mechanisms that we tap into. So
I want to pull on that before we move on, because we are going to focus on the gut. But in terms of intermittent fasting research in women, what are you finding is a very important message? And I know the windows may be a bit longer is what I've been hearing, but any take-home points you want women to hear for intermittent fasting?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because a lot of people will say women shouldn't fast, and it affects fertility. And I found that it depends on the type of fast again. So the most important factor in all of this is really educating you on how to fast. So yes, prolonged fasts for women where they're prolonging the fast for 24 hours or more probably isn't a good idea. The other thing that we need to be mindful of is when you fast, this isn't a starvation diet. This is just eating a good amount of calories during the time period. And if you want to lose weight, slightly less, but it's not starving. And I think the main factor in all of this, and why there has been this miscommunication about it, is we don't want to trigger that cortisol response, right? So our body has these stress responders. And as you probably already know, cortisol is one of them. It's released when our body feels stressed. And when we're starving, right, or we're not eating for very prolonged periods, our body sees that as a stress because it sees that we're not able to access food. So that's when we raise our cortisol. And then cortisol, unfortunately, is a substance or substance that helps to store fat also. So we kind of start to drop our metabolism, and this is where fertility is affected. However, there are so many studies that have actually shown that when it's done right and when it's done very logically and sensibly, it actually is very beneficial for women. Even during fertility, they've done studies on women with PCOS who usually have problems with fertility. And just a small amount of weight loss from restricting their eating times and intermittent fasting actually improves their fertility. We even see this in postmenopausal women who really should be benefiting from fasting, because we see that even a 10-pound weight gain postmenopausally leads to an increased risk of breast cancer. So women who are postmenopausal that want to practice intermittent fasting, same thing, just do it very sensibly and not go to the extreme where you're eliciting that cortisol response, because that's really what's causing the problem.
Okay, so that's helpful information, Dr. Bishara, and I want to segue to the gut now. I found on your website, I love this statement. You say, your gut is your medicine cabinet. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by this?
There are so many medications out there, so many expensive supplements and all these detox products and all of these things that you might not even need if you're eating to feed those trillions of organisms in your gut, because they are the ones that are producing all these byproducts, right? So when I say medicine cabinet, they're working on your immune system. They're producing neurotransmitters. They're producing vitamins. They're producing enzymes. And all of these things affect our health, right? And so why not prevent having to take medications that are sitting in our medicine cabinet by just feeding those gut bacteria what they love to eat and having them work hard for you because they want to work hard. At least the good ones do. The bad ones, they're lazy and they just want to eat garbage, processed foods, and they're not really good employees, as I mentioned in my book. Is you kind of have to think about your gut as like an enterprise, right? Or a company. and you're the CEO, and the decisions that you make affect their productivity. So this is what I mean by that.
Very empowering. I love that.
And when you started working with patients, what patterns and outcomes did you notice just kind of between clients?
In terms of weight loss patients or
patterns like in symptomology, maybe it's patterns in like just like trends that you were seeing in people's diets. Like what kind of things were you connecting across the board between patients?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of medical problems, but I kind of will focus on two because I think there's a direct link between these two. One is diabetes. So I see a lot of patients who even just gain a little bit of weight or conversely lose a little bit of weight. And if they're pre-diabetic or kind of just starting to become diabetic, they can reverse that with diet. And I think it's because if you think about how diabetes develops, right, it's your body's insulin production can't meet the demand of the food that you're bringing in, because we know that insulin is required to help glucose transport into cells. So if you're eating too much for your pancreas to make that insulin, it's not going to have enough. And so just eating a little bit less provides enough food for insulin, and we don't really tip into that, the borderline number for diabetes. That's one big one that I've seen. Another really big one that I've seen, and it kind of correlates to intermittent fasting, is fatty liver, which is something that a lot of times people aren't symptomatic from, but we find it on ultrasounds or CAT scans that we're kind of just doing. And I hate when it's written incidental finding of fatty liver, because for me, fatty liver kind of just starts that cascade of a lot of medical problems. So a really important way to decrease your incidence of fatty liver is, again, to restrict your eating times, because we know that we have this backup mechanism in our liver where we're storing glycogen to use for fuel as glucose. And so if we're continually not restricting eating times, we keep storing more and more glycogen into our liver, and that turns into fat eventually. So if we're just kind of restricting those eating times where we allow our body to tap into that mechanism of burning the glycogen, then that's something that also I've seen improve or completely disappear. So those are kind of two direct links. There are a lot of indirect links that I also see, but definitely everyone feels so much better when they've lost a little bit of weight, eaten healthier, they're restricting their eating times. They say, I wake up in the morning. In the past, I used to be really hungry. And then now that I'm used to fasting, I wake up feeling very energized with a lot of improvement in my cognitive function, which is another big one that I see.
And to clarify, Dr. Bishara, for people who maybe are in a stressful job, they're in a stressful time in their life, an 8-hour feeding window, is that appropriate, or would you bump it out to 12? I'm sure you're individualizing these programs.
Yes, definitely. So I mainly say the 8-hour one for people who want to lose weight, because what's happening is between 6 and 8 hours is when your body's tapping into fat, right? And it doesn't happen until at least 16 hours of fasting. So that's where people want to lose weight with fasting, then yes. But I would say if you're normal weight or really aren't that focus on losing weight, at least restrict to 12 hours, because even 12 hours of fasting, which I think is so doable, right? I mean, you start eating at 8 and end at 8. That's very doable. And then you're tapping into those glycogenolysis pathways, because those really start at around 8 to 10 hours where your body taps into glycogen from the liver. So even then you're getting that benefit. But the longer you fast, and it's not for everyone necessarily, the longer you fast, the better it is, especially if you want fat burning. So I kind of explain this all in my book. Like I have a table of what happens at every aspect of the hours. I get 4 hours.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, again, it's they're misinformed about fasting. And I wish we could go back and change the name to intermittent eating, because I think it sounds so much better.
Right? Oh, yes.
But
yes,
it does sound better.
Right?
Yeah.
People just kind of assume that fasting means restricting eating and starving, which it really isn't.
What about women with any type of hormonal imbalances? Do you like to do kind of a different approach with them and maybe wait to do some of the intermittent fasting, or you just have a more gentle approach in those cases?
I think it's more specific for each person uniquely, but I found that, again, I hate to say the word fasting because I think a lot of people just kind of get shocked from fasting is starving, but restricting eating times, but what you eat, right? So we know that feeding the good bacteria helps to regulate hormones, right? Because we have enzymes being produced. And one of these enzymes is an enzyme that affects estrogen metabolism, for example. So if you're eating foods that are not allowing this enzyme to break down estrogen properly, then you're going to have a hormone imbalance. So again, we're eating to feed them because they produce products that affect our hormones and our immune health. So it's kind of a unique thing that I will base on what somebody has, for example, different fertility issues or that. But a lot of it comes down to food. And as simple as that is, food is very powerful.
Absolutely. And with your mention of the microbiome, I'd love to start our talk on Bifidobacterium. And why is this particular bacteria so important? What have you found?
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. 5 years ago, I didn't know much about Bifidobacterium. I just knew that it was in a probiotic, and most probiotics have Bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. Those are the two that people know of, right? But I really didn't know the intricate functions of Bifidobacterium until COVID. And it was kind of this crazy thing that fell into our laps. So yes, my personal opinion of Bifidobacterium is number one, it deserved the MVP award for COVID because it was the most important factor for how you responded to the virus. But it's also a really important bacteria that kind of helps to set us up for the rest of our lives. So maybe I'll give a little summary on Bifidobacterium. And this is not coincidental, but children have a lot of Bifidobacteria. I would say about 60 to 80% of their gut has this one bacteria. So you have to ask yourself, well, why do they have so much of it, right? Infants, and usually it's there until about age of 10, and then the levels slowly start to decline as we get older. Now, are we supposed to have no Bifidobacteria in our gut when we're older? No, we're just supposed to have less of it because it does play a really important function in kind of priming our gut. And I always say it's nature's gift to children because it is such a potent immune regulator. It helps with children's immune system development. It helps with cognitive brain development. It helps to protect children from all these other diseases that are out there. So it's really a way to kind of prime their immune system. So now you look at COVID and you see that children didn't really get sick, right? Most of them didn't get very sick. I don't think we even have one case of a child dying strictly from COVID. Like they may have had a secondary problem that led to that, but it's because they have more of it. And, the way that we kind of came to this discovery and publication of our study is, again, I didn't really know that much about it. My husband is an ICU doctor. And so we live in New York City, and New York kind of got hit pretty early. And so they were starting to give these medications that inhibit an inflammatory marker called interleukin 6. And we know that interleukin 6 is one of those inflammatory markers that's high in a lot of people with metabolic problems. And it's like it's basically indicates how much inflammation you have. So what they were finding in their ICU was that when they give patients inhibitors of this inflammatory marker, their symptoms slightly improved. And so my husband was coming home and telling me, some of these patients are responding to this. And, he knew that I deal with a lot of patients who are overweight. And he said, do patients who are overweight have high interleukin 6 levels? Because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of patients who are overweight in our ICU. And I said, actually, it does because it indicates inflammation. And so we kind of just, in my head, I was like, I wonder why kids aren't really getting sick. So I just did a little bit of research, kind of just looked through all the data on Bifidobacteria. And believe it or not, it's actually a bacteria that was discovered close to 100 years ago. And it was discovered by a scientist named Elie Mishnikoff, who at the time, it was actually was more than 100 years ago, like the early 1900s. And he started noticing that it was incurring these great benefits to people when they were eating a lot of yogurt and fermented foods. And so he started making it this kind of panacea of improved health. Just eat foods that are rich in Bifidobacteria. And people were responding to this. And he actually won a Nobel Prize for his research. And then the World War II hit and people kind of just forgot about Bifidobacteria. But it's been around or at least we've known it's been around for obviously centuries, but we've just recently started to know about it. So with COVID, we started noticing that the function of Bifidobacterium, or one of the functions, is to decrease interleukin-6 levels. So we started kind of tying two and two together and thinking, well, these patients that are having high IL-6 levels, and then they go up even higher when they get COVID, and Bifidobacterium's function is to lower these levels, maybe there's something to it. And then we kind of started studying more intricate things like the cytokine storm, which is this influx of inflammation that their body releases when we get COVID. And again, with children, when they have enough of this bifidobacteria, it immediately recognizes the threat of COVID, and it downregulates all these inflammation pathways, right? And that's really what's going on. Is the virus per se is not killing us. It's the inflammation that results from the virus that causes this either minimal reaction or severe reaction. And so we published our study. Everyone thought we were crazy, but I knew that this was the missing link. And this was very early on, maybe April or May. The study was published in May, but even in April, when we were doing our research, I started telling everyone, start taking probiotics with very high doses of bifidobacteria, start taking zinc, and start taking vitamin D. And those three together, I don't think I had any patient that had to be hospitalized, honestly. Very interesting data that unfortunately, I wish we were able to get it out better back then. But I think there's a lot of skepticism, and unfortunately, we didn't. But 5 years later, I'm so happy that gut health now is kind of trendy, and we're hearing so much more about the functions of our gut bacteria and how important they are.
And I hope it's not just trendy. I hope that we are continuing to study the importance of the gut microbiome. I think it's immensely important, and we're realizing that more and more. And I sense we're at the tip of the iceberg with the research and the clinical implications. So thank you so much for contributing to that.
Thank you. And, there's so much that we know about the gut, but like you said, we've hit the tip of the iceberg where there's so much that we don't know. Mm-hmm. And not everything is like a concrete science with the gut microbiome. And we see that, right? Because we see people who live in different countries have a very different gut microbiome than we do here in the US. And there are, again, trillions of organisms. I think we identified maybe more than 20,000 different types. And so there's so much we need to learn about all these different bacteria, right? And fungi and viruses that are living inside our gut. And they take up at least 50% of our cells. So I think it's really important for us to study them more.
And you mentioned some different ways of supplementing with high dose probiotics that are really high in the bifidobacterium. What brands are you recommending? Because I know this can be a tricky situation trying to find a probiotic brand that can make it past our stomach acid and actually get it into the intestine. So what brands are you using?
Yeah, exactly. That's a really important point is I guess instead of making like a direct endorsement of certain brands, what I would say is, because I don't know all the brands and I don't want to, shun any brands that do have this. But what I do want to say is, look at your bottles, look at the back and look at the CFU count, which is the colony forming unit, right? Because that is a really important factor. And I know there are other factors that are important, like refrigeration, and there are different types of probiotics like spore forming and all of that. But if you're kind of just new to this, look at the back of the bottle. If it has less than probably 30 to 50 billion CFUs, I don't think it's going to make it to your lower intestine. You're getting a lot killed off. And so during COVID, our protocol was to give patients at least 120 billion a day. And so whatever probiotic you can get that gave you that's what we were doing. And we were doing it for as soon as they were diagnosed with COVID until their symptoms completely resolved. But yes, you're right. It's very important to look at the different brands and the bottles because they're not all made alike. So definitely the CFU count is very important. Another really important thing is single strain probiotics are really not good for long term, and they probably weren't that good for COVID either. So even though Bifidobacterium, I believe, was really the main fighter, you want a probiotic that has a lot of different strains because they do all work together. They're kind of like a team. of really good employees in your enterprise. So it's really important to have a lot of them work together, but definitely a lot of Bifidobacteria and lactobacillus is another important thing to look for.
And you mentioned earlier that children have a really high count of this kind of bacteria in their gut microbiome just naturally. But why is it that it's starting to taper off? I think you said around like 10 years old, it's starting to kind of taper off at that point. Like, why are we deficient as adults?
Yeah. I mean, I think in an ideal world, once you develop your adaptive immune system, right? Because we're born with that innate immune system, which is our gift with Bifido in it. And then you get exposed to different things in your environment, and that's your adaptive immune system, right? And it kind of builds this database. And so I think by the time you're 10, I think nature is like you developed enough that you don't need as much Bifidobacteria, right? So yeah, you still need Bifidobacteria, but you have all these other organisms and you've been exposed to different things to strengthen your immune system. So I think naturally there's just a drop, but I think what we are seeing now is this unnatural, dramatic drop in Bifidobacteria, which I think is really the problem. And it's because we're not feeding Bifidobacteria and these other beneficial bacteria what they need to eat. So they need certain things. They need plant-based fibers, which are very important foods for them because they have these fibers that they can digest and ferment and produce these byproducts. And if they're not getting the plant-based fibers, they're going to start to die off. And the harmful bacteria, they basically can eat anything and they like junk food. So I think what we're seeing now is the diets, especially the Western diet, has a lot less plant-based fibers and legumes and really important foods that we need to feed them. And so we're killing off Bifidobacteria, believe it or not. And I think for people who didn't really do well with COVID, either they were very deficient or they had no Bifidobacteria. And I think diet is a big part of it. And I'd love to talk about kind of the different diets that a lot of people eat thinking they're healthy, but might not necessarily be so healthy.
I was just going to ask, like, what's your take on this big movement towards a more animal-based diet versus plants?
Yeah. Personally, I'm a believer that I think we're able to tolerate and eat everything. So if you're somebody who, for example, just wants to be sensible, the studies have shown year in and year out is a Mediterranean style diet is shown to be the healthiest. So predominantly vegetarian type diets, a little bit of animal protein. Like I personally, I eat everything. I eat mostly a Mediterranean style, but then there are these advocates of like a very, very high animal protein keto style diet. And they call it carnivore, which is kind of an irony because if you look at the carnivores or the ancient ancestors' diet, a lot of people think it was just animal protein. It wasn't. There's no way that they were hunting all the time and only eating meat. Like that just couldn't have happened. And so what we're seeing is that just looking at teeth samples and different factors, and what they found is they actually predominantly ate plants and a little bit of animal protein. And so I think a lot of people have been misinformed about the carnivore diet because I think initially it does produce these great effects, which is weight loss, right? And the ketosis from a carnivore, or not necessarily carnivore, but like an animal-based protein diet is, they do get ketosis, right? And ketosis is great because it fuels our cells with these fat cells that are burned, and it's a much better fuel for our cells. But what happens over the long term with people who do only animal-based protein diets is you kind of are not feeding your good guys anymore. You're getting the benefits of ketosis, right? But those guys are dying off. And so you might lose the weight initially and you look really good and you feel really good and you're energetic. And that's really from the ketosis. But over time, you're starting to kill off those beneficial guys. And this is where I think sustainably a long-term keto diet is not. And I know a lot of people, they kind of get upset when I tell them this and they say, but I'm doing so well on the keto diet. And I say, that's great because ketosis is great, but induce ketosis through restricting your eating times and intermittent fasting, because that is a pathway that your body goes through, but it needs that restriction of time. And so when I explain it, that you're really predominantly feeding them and then less feeding yourself or what you like, some people get it. Some people are hardcore, like animal protein, lovers, and it's fine. But I personally think that you need to feed those guys, and those guys, the good guys anyway, they love plants. They need plants. The fiber is not for us to digest. It's for them to digest. And if you're eating too much of the fat and the animal protein, you're feeding certain harmful bacteria like Firmicutes who don't really necessarily make these great products. And we've seen that people who predominantly eat those kind of foods, their risk of colon cancer increases over the years.
You're reading my mind, Dr. Bishara. I just opened up to page 82 of your book. Again, for those who maybe are just tuning in or skipped ahead, here's her fabulous book. And I flagged this because you mentioned balance is key when it comes to certain bacteria like Akkermansia or Firmicutes. Too much of these two bacteria may not be a good thing, so a delicate balance is key. There's so much we're still learning about the gut and why the diversity of plant-based foods and the microbiome is important. So you spoke to, I say Firmicutes or Firmicutes, depending on my mood. You pronounce it a little bit differently, tomato. Can you speak to Akkermansia, too much of Akkermansia? I don't think that we've ever touched on that topic before.
Yeah, that's another elephant in the room. Everyone talks about Akkermansia and how great it is because, we have actually seen that people who are thin and healthier overall do have higher levels of Akkermansia than people who are obese. However, too much Akkermansia is not necessarily a good thing either because what does it do? It breaks down mucin, Akkermansia mucinophilia, right? It breaks down mucin in the gut. And that's good a little bit. But then when you have too much Akkermansia, that kind of delicate balance of mucin breakdown in the gut is affected, which is not good. And we've actually seen studies that show that too much Akkermansia causes an increased risk of cancer. So every time someone asks me about a single strain Akkermansia supplement that I know there are a lot out there, I kind of want to scream it out and say, don't take them for more than 2-3 months. If even that, just eat foods that feed Akkermansia. Really
way more sustainable.
Yeah. And we need diversity. We need all of those guys working together. We can't overload one good bacteria in the gut and just make them do all the work. We really need like a good team. And if you have too much Akkermansia, it's almost like they go crazy and they go psychotic and they're like, we're not working anymore. We're going to wreck your gut. So that's how I try to explain it. But too much Akkermansia is not a good thing either. Try to induce Akkermansia production through foods like apples with their skins, cranberries. There are a lot of foods that increase it naturally, and then have that delicate balance. So same thing with Firmicutes. A little bit of Firmicutes when we have it in our mouth, like a little bit is fine. But again, once we tip that balance where there's too much of it, they take over the workplace and they go crazy. So
right, all about balance there.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you just said there's a time and a place essentially for Akkermansia supplementation. Are you using it as needed for maybe a blood sugar issue? And it's a tool of many in a toolbox. So are you implementing it in that way or in another way for another indication?
I'm not kind of surreptitiously recommending it. I like to look at the gut microbiome first. I like to look at whether or not you're low in your Akkermansia levels, for example. What other risk factors do you have? And so I know this is a vibrant podcast, but it's my favorite test, the gut zoomer, because it gives me kind of a window into what's going on in your gut. So if you're very, very low in Akkermansia, for example, I will say it's okay to take a supplement for 60 days, for example. But again, it's all about balance. And for me, the most important factor is food. Increase those guys with food instead of with a supplement. Supplement should be just that, supplemental. And I always talk about food. And then I'm so happy because a recent study came out in Nature magazine, I think a few weeks ago, which said, of all the things that can improve the gut microbiome, food is actually the most impactful. And I love that because we're all eating, right? And we all can change our diet. And the study was done on mice. However, maybe you know this. The reason we pick mice for a lot of studies is they have a very similar kind of metabolic system that we do, and they don't have a long lifespan, so we can kind of test things in a shorter period. But in the mice that were fed a really healthy diet versus a poor diet, They found that the microbiome of those eating really healthy foods actually improved pretty quickly. And the ones not eating such healthy foods, it actually impacted their microbiome pretty quickly also. So, and I think we all veer off the healthy path every once in a while. And I think it's totally fine and your body's able to deal with that. But if you're somebody who's constantly eating unhealthy, you're going to affect your microbiome, and it might be too late to kind of replenish all of these beneficial bacteria like Bifidobacteria. So once you get down to zero, it's a little tough to get it back in. So that's kind of like another intricate balance.
Right. Yes. And I want to dive into foods. I'm curious kind of what your favorite plant-based fiber-rich meals are. I think that would be fun to talk about. But briefly, before we move on, I think early life factors are fascinating in terms of how they can impact our microbiome. So birth method, whether we are born via C-section or vaginal birth, whether we're breastfed or not, antibiotic use, of course, that's what we focus on oftentimes. Having pets even as we're growing up for that biodiversity. I think that's very interesting as well. Any pearls of wisdom there? I don't like to focus too much on this. I said, go over it briefly because we can't change the past.
Yes.
Right. So if this is influencing us, then it's helpful to maybe make note of that in the timeline. But obviously we can't change those things, and we want to focus on what we can control. So any kind of interesting pearls of wisdom in terms of early childhood factors that you like to maybe review with your patients?
Yeah.
Do you even?
I do. When I do a gut wellness evaluation with my patients, I frequently ask them if they were breastfed when they were young, or if they received antibiotics when they were young, or if they were born vaginally. And I think a lot of patients are like, why are you asking me these questions? But it's exactly what you said, is those are factors that actually impact our microbiome early on. Even what my mom ate impacted my microbiome. Yeah. And so, like, for example, I'll talk about breast milk and breastfeeding. And I'm 54, so I came from a generation where I think formula kind of was like new and fancy, and like this is the new great thing. And so
convenient.
Yeah, and exactly convenient. And so I think that probably wasn't so good for a lot of us. I'm probably somebody who was affected by that. But what we've seen is that colostrum and breast milk, number one, they have these amazing fatty acids that are rich in like really good fats that are feeding us, but they're feeding our microbiome too. And bacteria like Bifido, for example. And when the bacteria eat these things, we're actually feeding certain strains of bacteria, certain strains of Bifidobacteria that we know are very important early immune regulators, like Bifidobacteria breve. You could only feed breve through colostrum and breast milk. So right there, if your levels of Bifidobacterium breve are higher than somebody else, for example, another baby, you're actually already kind of primed for like really good immune health. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think a lot of us didn't know is vaginal births versus cesarean. And babies that are born vaginally, they're kind of, I call it like a baptism, right? Like they're baptized with mom's vaginal flora, which has a lot of really important bacteria. And then what do we do when we first deliver babies? Like they're given a bath right away. And found that might not necessarily be the best thing, right? It might be worth delaying the bath for 24 hours, kind of to allow baby to absorb those beneficial bacteria. I always like to put a disclaimer. Like there's some bacteria that are harmful, obviously, that we test for. And obviously, if like be strep, if you have that, then it's not a good idea. But I think for the most part, that's another really important thing. But yeah, I mean, antibiotic use early on can affect our microbiome. So you're right. Like all these factors can affect our microbiome, but some of these factors we have no control over. So what I say is, yes, they may impact your baby's microbiome, but again, the microbiome is very resilient, and through diet, we're seeing that it can be improved. So don't give your baby, like refined carbs very early on. They're actually saying don't give your baby sugar for the first 3 years of your life because it makes a difference. So I always tell moms, like new moms, I say just, give them breast milk as much as you can. I know sometimes it's hard, and a lot of women have to go back to work, pump and save, even if you just get that 2 weeks, right? So it's so important to kind of be mindful of the factors and then work on kind of tweaking them.
Well said.
What advice do you have for patients that maybe when they were younger, they were on a lot of antibiotics or they weren't breastfed long enough, if or at all? What are you doing kind of beyond that point to kind of maybe do some course correction? Like you mentioned colostrum earlier. Is that something you recommend supplementing with as an adult, or were you just referencing it in the fact that that's something that we're given when we're younger that helps with the gut microbiome?
Yeah, I mean, there are some studies that show colostrum's helpful as, for adults. I think I read a story that Khloe Kardashian was like drinking her own colostrum and breast milk.
Of course.
Khloe or one of the Kardashian sisters. Somebody must have told her it has, high bifido, it's feeding bifido, but I don't mind colostrum. But again, I want us to move away from supplements and additional things versus, unless you have, somebody obviously breastfeeding nearby you and you want to drink their colostrum, that's great. But I want to move more towards food, right? And again, we've seen that diet is impactful. So when I do have patients that may have not had the best case scenario when they were babies or younger, is I really try to incorporate more plant-based foods for them. And then, if they don't have SIBO or any contraindications, we start to slowly add fermented foods. So always, always, always food first. And then based on how they respond, I will definitely recommend certain supplements, probiotics, things like that.
And I want to circle back, Dr. Bishara, to functional medicine testing. I'm curious about any patterns you see maybe between the stool tests. You mentioned the gut zoomer. Are you measuring micronutrients? Are you looking at hormones? What kind of connections, maybe organic acids? If you are using other functional medicine tests regularly in practice, are there any patterns that you find interesting between those two?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is why I love the gut zoomer, because it kind of gives you an overall picture. But two things that I look at, two big ones that I look at are the diversity indexes. Again, because we know that research shows gut diversity is one of the most important factors for health. So there's two indexes, Shannon's and Simpson's index, that I look at. And those basically measure the diversity of your gut. So the more diverse your organisms are, the healthier we've been told it is. So I like to look at those indexes because those kind of tell me what's going on in your gut, whether or not you have a variety of these organisms. Another really important one that I look at is zonulin. We know that high zonulin levels also are indicated associated with not the best gut microbiome. IgA levels I look at also, calprotectin. Those are kind of the three big ones that I look at. And then I look and see what overall is going on with nutrient deficiencies, vitamin B12. Like, why aren't you absorbing certain vitamins? Is it a leaky gut? But I think if I had to, I guess, would say one, it would definitely be the diversity indexes, because again, we've seen that's a really important factor. And then I guess the next question a lot of people ask me is, well, how do I increase my diversity?
Yes.
There's like a magic number that they've studied, and it's 25 to 30 different plant-based foods a week. So just make that list, that grocery list, and make sure there's like 25 to 30 on there, and make sure you're making a variety during the week. And it can be easy as making a smoothie, where you kind of put a bunch of different ones. So already you have like 4 or 5 different fruits and vegetables in there. But yeah, just get creative. And again, I mean, if you're going to remember anything about this conversation, is there are all these different bacteria in your gut, and they all have favorite foods. So one guy or gal might like, mangoes. Another might like blueberries. Another might like asparagus. So we don't know who likes what. So we're kind of just eating a diverse rainbow of foods to feed all of them.
I love that. And Emmie had mentioned your book a couple of times throughout the podcast. So I wanted to talk about that, highlight it a little bit, just let our audience know that it's out there. So your book, The Gut Revolution, I mean, that's such a powerful name. Like, what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, I think as much as I think that people know about gut health, there are a lot of people that don't know that much. Maybe I think when you're in your own kind of wellness world, you think everyone outside your world knows.
Yes,
but
exactly.
Yeah, a lot of people don't really know anything about the gut. And I think post-COVID, I'm glad that there are now more people learning about the gut. But at the time, I was very frustrated with the fact that we weren't hearing enough about gut health, about Bifidobacteria. And so for me, I kind of wanted to start a revolution of people learning about the gut. So that's why I called it the Gut Revolution. And I think it's a book that, or at least I tried to make it a book that someone with a medical background would be stimulated and enticed by the information, but also simple enough and simplified enough that someone without a medical background can still absorb the information and apply it to their life. So that's kind of where I was interested in writing it, just kind of starting this revolution of improved health and letting your body be the best doctor.
I have to say, Dr. Bishara, also that the way you speak about the microbiome in this very charming way, this very let's make friends with the microbiome, let's have a very positive outlook, let's feed them their favorite foods. I think that that's a very patient-friendly perspective, and that's very helpful. And I do see that shine through in the book. And I will say that the formatting is really great. It's a narrative format, but you can also see that there are these very easy to read bullet lists and things to remember. So I find that very helpful, and some infographics throughout there. So I wanted to point that out for listeners. And before we wrap it up, going back to food, which is always going to be my favorite topic, what are some of your go-to gut microbiome friendly meals that you're loving right now?
I love to make lentils and onions together.
Oh, that's a powerhouse right there.
Yeah.
Reel in all these amazing fibers. So I'll saute some onions in like some avocado oil until they get caramelized. And then I'll put a little bit of tomato paste, and then I'll cook lentils with them. And it's an amazing meal. It's so good, so tasty. So that's like a big one that I try to have at least once a week. The other ones that I really like to kind of incorporate are asparagus. And don't cut off just a little bit of the ends, because those ends, those tuber ends, they're really inulin rich.
The very woody ends that we snap off. I snap them off. I mean, I snap off like a good couple inches generally.
Yeah. So try not to. I know they're not as tasty, but again, let's have that, I guess that visual of like, well, I'm feeding the good guys the woody ends because they really love it.
You really got to chew on it, and imagine them like really working hard on them too.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, you're chewing on it hard, but then like, it's like a feast for them. So that's a big one that I really like. I will try to incorporate some cruciferous vegetables too, like cauliflower and broccoli, which I think they're kind of, I wouldn't say bland, but they have like a neutral taste, or at least cauliflower does. And cauliflower is another really, really good one. And then like fruit wise, mango is one of my favorites. And there's like little stringy fibers, like those are feeding certain bacteria too. It's like a dessert for the guys.
Yes.
And, like blueberries have been shown to be really good for our gut bacteria too. So those are kind of just like my favorites.
Dr. Bishara, if anyone tuning in today wants to connect with you online, really resonates with your message, or wants to maybe even read your book, where can we find you online?
I'm on most of the social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok less, but and I'm under my name, Doctor, which is spelled out Dr. Christine B. But also, like, if anyone's listening, for example, if you're a student and studying in the health sciences, or even not, and you want me to do a talk on gut health, I mean, I love that Zoom and virtual, platforms came about, because I'm really passionate about teaching anyone and everyone just a little bit about gut health. So if you're somebody that say, you know what, this might be a really important curriculum to add to my school or college, reach out to me. My email is on my website. So yeah, I think we're slowly starting to get there.
Awesome. We'll link these down below for you guys. If you want to connect with Dr. Bishara online, check the comments. And thank you so much for spending the last hour or so with Dr. Emmie and I. It's been great having you on the show, and definitely inspired to go get some more plants into my diet this week. It's just always a good reminder when we have these episodes. So thank you so much again for sharing with us. And until next week, I'm wishing us all vibrant health and wellness. Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week, And just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guests and hosts are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.